All right, buckle up, everyone. This one's a lot. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of, I don't know, there's a lot of back and forth, and it's only part one of two. There's a lot of ground that we're going to cover, and I love this. Okay, so here's what this episode's about. It's primarily that the way that AI gets developed and deployed leads to certain kinds of geopolitical risks. This is partly because there's lots of different factions, lots of different people, lots of different interests and values in the world. So when we talk about the alignment problem, it's misleading because we're not just trying to align it with human values as though there was just one set of values that humans endorse, but rather there's all different kinds of values that different kinds of people have. And so how do you create AI in a way that sort of respects all those different competing interests, values, et cetera? That's one of the kinds of things that we're talking about. And one reason why this is so pressing is the pervasiveness of AI. So we're not just talking about, look, you like that movie, I like this movie, or this culture operates this way and that other culture operates that other way. It's that the way that AI acts has such an impact because of the scale at which it acts that we're talking about major impacts on society and culture. So that's another sort of aspect of this conversation. The thing that we're driving at, that my guest is driving at, by the way, my guest is Brian Wong. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Hong Kong. The thing that he's driving at is that we're all responsible for the harms that AI causes on a sort of geopolitical scale. That's a big thesis. So there's two concepts that I want to flag right now because they're going to come up and they're really central to Brian's thinking. There's the accountability gap, what he calls the accountability gap, and the accountability deficit. So an accountability gap is when there's lots of cooks in the kitchen, there's lots of people responsible for some people getting harmed in some way or other, and it's not clear how to assign responsibility given all those cooks in the kitchen, given that all those people played some causal role in that bad thing happening. And when we can't point to a discrete individual, let's say it's a murder, right? If Bob murdered someone, okay, Bob is accountable. But putting that kind of case to the side where we have the everyday actions of everyday people leading to really bad outcomes, at least for some subset of people, you have an accountability gap in that there's no discrete individual that is accountable or responsible. It's something like either no one is accountable or everyone is. That's Brian's thought, and he lands on everyone is. The accountability deficit is essentially when some people get wronged or someone gets wronged or lots of people get wronged and they're owed something, they're owed compensation of some sort, but they don't receive it. And so Brian's sort of big thesis is something like there's an accountability gap when it comes to AI, and there's an accountability deficit when it comes to the harms that people are suffering. And that creates very difficult questions about responsibility and who's responsible for those things. So this sort of conversation is leading up to this big thing about everyone is responsible. And there's a way in which all of this is in some ways abstract, but for philosophers, this is actually fairly concrete. It's leading up to in this whole episode, we're talking about the sort of concrete thing that leads up to, the concrete thing is people are getting hurt by AI by the virtue of everyday actions of everyday people, not to mention the actions of corporations, blah, blah. We're leading up to this position where we have to think about what does it mean for all of us to be responsible? What does that actually amount to? How can everyone be responsible? That sort of feels like nobody is, maybe. So this first part of the conversation, which is quite long and dense and really fascinating in my view, it leads up to us to that point where we have to start looking for deeper philosophical foundations for how to conceive of distributed responsibility, distributed accountability. And so that's what the second episode is about. That'll come next week. So this is concrete in a way for philosophers, people getting harmed by AI, people, how do we hold everyone looks to be responsible for that sort of thing, or plausibly anyway. And part two is philosophical underpinnings. And so what I really like about these two episodes in particular is that it starts with concrete concerns like people getting hurt, and then we zoom out to broader philosophical assumptions that are being made in that discussion. And then we start doing, if you like, really hardcore philosophy in the next episode. So I hope that for those of you who are not philosophers, that it helps you to see the way in which these sort of more specific debates and discussions and issues depend upon certain kinds of philosophical assumptions, which leads us to do philosophy. And that's where, in many cases, the value of philosophy comes from, because you start really analyzing those underlying assumptions and seeing how they bear on the concrete particular issues that you're talking about. Okay, big topic. That's what this episode's about. If you haven't already, please subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, blah, blah, blah. You can buy my book if you want, Ethical Machines. You can go to my Substack. I stopped running ads as of, I think, last week because I'm also a listener to this podcast and I cannot stand ads. So I just took them away. They're just too annoying. If you want to support the podcast, you can go to readblackman.substack.com. I lowered the sort of annual rate to quite low. I forgot what the monthly is. I don't know, $5 or something. Anyway, if you want to support the podcast, I'd appreciate it. readblackman.substack.com. And you can email me with questions, comments, thoughts, blah, blah, blah at, what is it? em@readblackman.com. All right, let's go talk to Brian. All right, so Brian, let me try to understand your position before we start really getting to the rationale for it. So I guess there's sort of two parts to the view of your many views. I know you have many views, but the one we'll be talking about today is something like AI introduces compounding geopolitical risks. That's the sort of part one. And part two was something like the mitigation or the avoidance of those risks is owned by everyone. It's universally shared. So am I capturing the two parts right? And if so, can you say a little bit more about what geopolitical risks we're talking about, how AI comes to compound them?
Yeah, look, thanks for having me, Reed. And I think just before I delve into the risk dimension of my sort of vision and project here, it's worth noting that actually, if you take a bird's eye view of the picture and also what I do at large, there are really two components to the way I see the rise of AI as interacting with geopolitics. And first is, of course, the risks and the downsides and all the adverse effects we'll talk about in just a second. But I don't want us to think that this project is purely negative and that it's exclusively oriented around scaremongering or doomsday scenario forecasting, which it isn't really anyway when it comes to risks, but right? And that's not the sort of gist of the argument there. But in any case, there's also the dividends aspect. The second aspect being essentially the upsides, the benefits that the rise of AI could bring for geopolitical stability, for the amelioration of tensions, the mitigation of risks, and also tackling of global challenges at large. So I want to emphasize I'm not sort of coming at this question through lenses of just, AI's rise is risky and innately negative. But let's focus on the risk component for now.
The sky is not falling. You're not a doomer.
The sky is falling in some ways. It could also be the rise of, or the falling of manna from heaven as well, even though, of course, manna is too exaggerated hyperbole. We get the sense that essentially the upsides and also the downsides could be immense unto their own. And quite simply put, it can't be treated or conceptualized as cancelling one another out in a very sort of simplistic aggregationist, consequentialist manner, right? And that's the purpose of looking at both the existential risks associated with the rise of AI, but also what I call the substantive or the normative, the immense normative benefits to be acquired and reaped from the rise of AI as well. So we'll park that aside for now and return to the benefits question later. Let's focus on risks. And on the front of risks, I would argue that the rise of AI and also existing geopolitical structures or geopolitical conflicts, they intertwine with one another in creating what I call compounded risks across a number of facets and areas. And I just want to start with the most obvious sort of dimension of the equation here. And this is what I call the complex multi-alignment problem. Alignment problem, I'm sure, for many of us here listening to this podcast is pretty straightforward, okay? Goal misgeneralization, reward hacking, you hear these terms bandied around a lot. But the way I would describe the alignment issue or the alignment problem is quite simply put that there exists a non-trivial possibility that AI models and agents would behave in ways, produce outputs, generate preferences, and act in accordance with these preferences in a manner that is non-conforming to, okay, or non-aligned with insert something, a blank, of human beings. Now, that blank could be interests, that blank could be values, that blank could be the preferences and desires, that blank could also be overarchingly the most risk-averse and risk-minimizing function of as an aggregative function of, so to speak, of human preferences. It's unclear what that blank is, but we are broadly speaking aligned, pun intended, amongst the philosophical community. If a non-alignment were to occur and a non-alignment were to exist, then this would reflect really a discrepancy between how AIs behave and how we intend for them to behave, essentially. So I'm not going to relitigate the classic paperclip or alternatively the less sort of cliched but perhaps more nuanced demonstrations of the alignment problem, because I'm sure there are far more qualified AI researchers and guests who can do that on a podcast. But all I'm going to say here is, drawing upon Yazon Gabriel's paper, right? whose values are we aligning with the AI here? And that question that he asked in that paper is fascinating, because we spend a lot of time talking about humans and AI as if the two could be treated as some sort of homogenous entities, and yet we neglect the innate diversity and heterogeneity amongst human beings. And put it quite bluntly, right? You might have someone who's a 60-year-old, their conception of values and interests may not overlap entirely with a 16-year-old, and that's within the same society. But what about different polities, different political communities, different cultural systems, where there could very well be divergences in the kind of values that are treated and seen as normatively substantiated and valid in the first place. And secondly, even where there exist common values that overlap across different cultures, the weights that we ought to assign to one particular value over another in the event of a conflict and also contradictions. And so you might envision a very communitarian culture saying, look, I'm always going to prioritize, because that's what I personally believe, right? The community's overarching interest, political stability, the establishment and adherence to authorities and hierarchies over individual liberties. That's what I value and treasure. And yet in a society, that's the exact opposite of that. You might have a distinctly greater emphasis upon individualism. And so when it comes to AI agents that are fed information, fed essentially inputs from which it learns, well, the question here becomes, which societies are we sourcing the data inputs from and the behavioral inputs from? Because these are largely inputs from which the learning then occurs. And we could easily then imagine, in the event of increasing data siloing and firewalling of data, we're seeing securitization of data, not just by private companies and corporations in the US, but also by state-led entities, and also top-down impositions of restrictions of access and exporting of data by, of course, authoritarian governments, by centralizing governments. Then the impact here, Reid, is really a world where we'll see lots of bifurcation and also splintering when it comes to data, and thus the kind of preferences and the exhibited values of AI models that are generated. So my concern here has to do with a complex non-alignment across different models developed across the world, which would compound the pre-existing human AI non-alignment equation in question by creating scenarios where different kinds and sets of humans' preferences really driving the equation, and thus there's non-alignment between them two, as well as non-alignment between human actors and also AI agents vis-a-vis the insert blank that I talked about just then. So we go into other elements, but I think this is an interesting sort of starting point that we can conceptualize and frame really the thesis of my project around, which is what happens when you put all these well-known and well-substantiated risks to do with AI behaviors in a context of real-world politics, and also the divides and the schisms that we see increasingly in a world we inhabit.
All right, so there's two parts at least. So one is a rejection of the language of, or the approach of, human-centric alignment, because that's way too coarse-grained, as you said. Humans are not a monolithic group. There's lots of disagreements. So talk of the alignment problem, which is aligning it with human values, doesn't make much sense at all, unless you think of humans as all being the same, having the same interests or similar interests, and no conflict and no disagreements on values, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I get the rejection of that. That seems totally plausible. The second part of what you're saying sounds something like, you don't have the alignment problem. We have the alignment problems, which is how do we align each of these various AIs with the different cultures in which they're supposed to operate. It's something like that. And then I guess my question is, it sounds on the one hand, and maybe I'm mishearing you or misinterpreting, that this is a problem. As opposed to, why not think, look, let 1,000 flowers bloom. We have lots of cultural disagreement on all sorts of things. Those differences across cultures, across individuals, about should we prioritize the community or the individual or the state and the nation, et cetera, et cetera. That shows up in our political systems, our social norms, our respective TV shows and movies. And so that variance already shows up in pretty much every tool that we create. And it shows up in AI too. Why? And you began to hint at an answer, I think, but to get it clear, why does bringing in AI present a special problem as opposed to, this is just another way in which our differences show up?
Fantastic question, Reid, because I think what you're really striking at here is what's so sui generis about AI, right? And I guess before I delve into that, again, I'm going to be the annoying person in the room and just say, take a step back and think, okay, let's set aside AI for now. But we look at the world as it exists out there. whether it be in terms of the media, the digital platforms, and also the wide range of applications we use where there already exists geopolitically induced fragmentation and fracturing. Is that big? Is it really that big of a deal, right? This is happening in the status quo. And I would actually say, yes, it
Yeah.
is, right? It is quite troubling that you've got, when it comes to, say, short video based social media platforms that are powered by algorithms, it is quite troubling that you've got, say, TikTok and Douyin and a Little Red Note and also some, say, Snapchat or Instagram. Each of these platforms curating vastly different content that are masquerading or presented as if that's all there is to the world that exists. But in fact, there might be ideological biases and presumptions, whether it be nationalistic, jingoistic, chauvinistic, you name it, that are embedded within the way these algorithms operate on individuals, and such that the sort of siloing and the existence of regulatory gulfs between these different platforms do create, right, divergences in worldviews that in turn reify and reinforce nationalistic identities and discourses. And it's not purely hypothetical. You've got certain platforms that might bolster or prop up just in virtue of revenue and also click generation. They might tug at the heartstrings of their audiences by drumming up nationalistic sentiments, by portraying foreign countries as the enemy, as the other, or by castigating values that are non-conformist to the mainstream. So I am worried about, just setting aside the AI question for now, this sort of broader tech splintering and fragmentation phenomenon we see in the status quo. But specifically on AI, there are three sui generis elements as to why AI is uniquely more troubling, okay, than the other manifestations here, so to speak. The first being just in terms of incomprehensibility and also inexplicability of many of the behaviors and outputs of AI. We can control, broadly speaking, what we do with regards to a laptop's word producing program. We just type, or we can choose to type, we can choose to use autocorrect or not, so on and so forth. There are choices that we can make, there are decisional moments that we can use to basically set boundaries and parameters to what can be generated by Word, by PowerPoint, by you name it, these various applications we use that are not AI powered, so to speak, in the status quo, to the extent that we choose to not use AI. And yet, in the case of AI, we can't really control the outputs that it automatically, as an AI model, generates. Right? We can, of course, apply retrospective filtering. We can say we don't like these outputs, get someone to throw a feedback loop, so to speak, set these filters and parameters that we apply retrospectively to the output stage to eliminate these awful answers. But there's no straightforward control and also explainability underlying that control that we can say, yes, I have total and perfect ability on my part to explain what's going on with a model, to predict what's going on with a model. In fact, the whole point of generative AI, specifically generative AI, is the unpredictability to some extent of this, ironically, probability-based mechanism. Yeah, but it's so complex that by saying it's probability-based, that doesn't mean anything to someone like you and I, or even the smartest person in the room, so to speak. So there's one layer of explainability come certainty that I think is quite germane here. And the second dimension that we can think of, really, is also how AI is endowed with, in many ways, more control and also more ability to influence our everyday affairs as compared with other forms of technologies, right? Of course, social media platforms, they shape what we consume and take to be true. But more broadly speaking, when it comes to, say, infrastructure, when it comes to the digitalization of infrastructure, for instance, or advanced manufacturing of, say, electric vehicles, these are all specific tools that we can use. I don't have to use an EV. I don't have to ride or drive an EV or be a passenger in it, so to speak. I can opt out of it quite easily. And yet, in the case of AI, generative AI is only one amongst many types of AI that exist out there. You think about discriminative AI in classification, AI in processing and predictive algorithms used in everything ranging from insurance schemes to public healthcare systems and allocation of resources. The ubiquity of AI, but also the prevalence of AI in each and every domain of our lives, renders it, again, rather unique from a point of view of the pervasiveness of the technologies, right? See, if you have the pervasiveness and unpredictability and inexplicability of AI rolled into one, then the complex alignment problem that I talked about just then truly is quite pernicious because of how it shapes the everyday lives of individuals who may not have the right to resist, who say, I don't want to be, or I want to opt out of this. They can't. They cannot opt out of a structure that, whether it be through state enforcement or the logic of private markets, continues to perpetrate itself over time and also across different places.
Sorry, so you said there were three
Yeah,
things that
two.
made it
Let's just
too
focus on
generous.
those two, right? The two that I highlighted. Good. Very,
Two.
very
Okay,
good.
got it. Sorry,
Well spotted,
I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. Okay, let's start with the second one. I have things to say about the explainability and control, but let's put that to the side. I think you used the word pervasiveness. I wonder if another way of putting it is something like AI, because AI is so pervasive, it means that power is concentrated in the AI. So you have single models or maybe a handful of models that have an outsized impact on everything else. So when I said earlier, look, what's the big deal? We've already got movies and TV shows and political systems and social norms, blah, blah, blah. Why get worked up about AI expressing a certain set of values that might not be aligned with the values of some other state, whatever it is? And I take it that part of your answer is something like, this is not just a movie. It's not a viral meme or something like that. It's a tool or a suite of tools that will show up in so many places that it will have a huge impact. And so while there might be other things that have that kind of an impact, like a political system, nonetheless, this is its own sufficient sort of like locus of power such that it deserves its own analysis. How do we make this thing such that it's going to fit into the geopolitical system and make sure that it's going to have outsized impacts? How do we make sure that those outsized impacts aren't on the whole, to put it broadly, negative? Something like that.
The only sort of minor quibble or contestation I'd offer there is I wouldn't necessarily use the word locus. I would use essentially the idea or supposed language of capillaries. I see in many ways AI as operating like capillaries of action, essentially, because it doesn't. It means that we're not talking here specifically about one interface, one product, one location that you can pinpoint and say, this is where it happens. But instead, it's about the subtler changes that we also start partaking in and subconsciously in our lives. And I'll give you one very visceral example. For instance, if we are using AI to analyze our sleep patterns, okay? And now obviously, you can say the locus of AI's action there is the program that we use. We input our data of breathing patterns and also our pulse and all of that into the program, and then we ask, please diagnose this and assess this. And of course, using some pretty rudimentary at this point by now, so diagnostic approaches to matching and also corroborating our data and biostatistics with other statistics out there, the AI generates a report. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. That's the locus of diagnosis of my health when I sleep. And yet, when I sleep, I'm thinking too that, okay, this is going to be tracked and captured by a program that would then, of course, be processed and interpreted through AI. I would start anxiously pondering, okay, what does this mean for, what if the AI gets it wrong? What if my health comes up this way as opposed to that way? I feel surveilled by, therefore, a program I've ironically, voluntarily, nominally opted into myself. And I would also think about the way I compare with others, right? What if others' sort of data results and biostatistics suggest that they're much healthier than I am, so on and so forth. Now, these thoughts, these psychological moments, okay, they are really the means by which technology pervades our lives, even independent of our direct usage of it. And I'm going to say that this is almost like the kind of Butlerian notion of performativity, right? I'm trying to perform this routine of health and self-care, even if no one's pointing a gun to my head and saying you have to do it. And that's because quite naturally speaking, and using this application, I'm enforcing upon myself this sort of discipline, right? This disciplining of my own body, of my own health, of my own psychological state that I have to take seriously. And what I'm suggesting here is AI operates not just in this particular domain of health monitoring and diagnostics in such a manner, but also across many other domains of our lives, right? So when I write an essay, as say I'm a student, right? If I write an essay, I wouldn't just think, okay, how can I write the best essay? But also, if the assignment says no AI allowed, I'm going to say, how can I maximize the non-AI-ness of my essay to avoid being perceived and construed as using an AI? Or if I'm a cheating student, I'd use an AI, then try to use another AI to de-AIify or to lower the extent to which my essay resembles that of a ChatGPT generated essay. These are all subtle yet important ways in which, even in the absence of direct usage of technologies, the technologies are operating upon us. And that is why I think, rather than saying locus, we should use capillaries of action as an alternative way of describing the stakes involved here.
Okay, so There are two things. One might be a pushback. One might be just asking for clarity. The potential pushback is we've been talking a little bit, although not totally, but a little bit as the AI, whether it's aligned with the culture, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, there are lots of different AIs. Different companies make different AIs. Yes, there's a sort of smaller, there's only a few of the foundation model companies like
OpenAI,
Anthropic or OpenAI. Yeah. But, right, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, et cetera. But those get modified or can be modified in a great variety of ways. Their outputs can, in various ways, be tailored to the individual to whom they're talking, right? So when I speak to Claude's got background information about me because I gave it. And so when it engages with me, it engages with information in its sort of context window that I want it to have. When it talks to you, Brian, it doesn't have that information, so it's not. So it's going to respond to us differently. So one pushback is, or maybe it's not a pushback, but it's a bit of a challenge, I suppose. Perhaps making out AI to be too monolithic in the critique if we say we've got these AIs that are aligned with the values and the Hong Kong AI is going to be in conflict with the New York City AI and so on and so forth. So, which is exactly what you were trying to resist on the human-centric front, because the whole point was, no, humans aren't monolithic, blah, blah, blah. Why should we think the AIs are monolithic? And then the second thing is, I'm beginning to lose the thread of how this connects to geopolitical risks as opposed to just shitty ways that AI might impact our lives, like making us feel surveilled, be engaged in performative actions. And that feels bad, but not a
let's start with the latter question first. I think that's a very good reminder, right? Because I was trying to explain the mechanisms by which power is exercised in general across AI models. And in so doing, of course, I was shifting away from the geopolitical thesis and the component thesis. So thanks for the reminder. And just very quickly, one thought, data siloing. Increasingly, the data with which AI models are trained by corporations across different countries is getting siloed, siloed off, whether it be because of the securitization by the state or a privatization of the inputs and the raw inputs and the commercialization of them, but also lack of accountability over the kind of quality of inputs. And here I'm thinking, of course, the notorious ignominy surrounding the data labeling, of the inputs used for the training of models by OpenAI that I'm not going to go into too much detail about, but you can, of course, look towards the global south for plenty of countries where very cheap labor has been engaged, whether it be knowingly or unknowingly by various actors in the Silicon Valley to do the quote-unquote dirty labor of data labeling for them. And the kinds of data sources from which, of course, these models drew, whether they be YouTube or Baidu or Bilibili, these various platforms from which the data was sourced, again, would shape, right, the nature of the outputs that are eventually generated by said models. And I would say that in a world with increasing hostility, geopolitical divides, and where data is now seen as a new gold by governments, by corporations and investors, so to speak, that is a mechanism by which geopolitics is shaping AI model development. Whereas 20 to 30 years ago, there was much more of an emphasis upon a shared, commonly sourced reservoir of data that AI developers and scientists across the universities, across different communities, could just draw upon and tap into in order to train their models, so to speak. The second element, of course, is the kinds of conversation that we're having right now about AI. We look at the headlines, we look at the sort of top 30,000 feet level overview of how AI discourse has evolved. 5 years ago, all the way up until approximately 3.5 years ago, AI safety was by and large anchored and oriented around, of course, solving challenges pertaining to alignment, dealing with possible tail end X risks, even though that, of course, was seen as attached to and affiliated perhaps a tad too much with the EA movement that then, of course, suffered its own setbacks, so to speak. And yet, fast forward 3 years, just look at the past 9 months, really, of AI-centered discourse, and you would notice and detect a palpable shift towards security, less about AI safety, far less about AI safety, and far more about security, far more about ensuring that we don't let our adversaries get hold of AGI or advanced AI. Let's just swap out AGI, just talk about advanced AI, good AI, whatever you call it, right? Don't let them win. We can't let them win. Now, these narrative shifts are subtle, and yet I think it's imperative to call them out because they ultimately signal a shift in attention and also resource allocation away from what I take to be quite important fundamental issues of alignment-oriented research towards privatization, or rather restricting access, gatekeeping access, and kneecapping others' ability to develop cutting-edge AI. And this is not just coming from one side of the Pacific to another. Like, let's face it, it's coming from all directions and heading in all directions as well, right? It's not as if the Europeans or the Chinese, especially the Chinese, aren't also worried about losing the quote unquote AI race, right? And all this talk about the Chinese being ostensibly more magnanimous and more willing to engage in a kind of benign and benevolent AI development, that's rooted to some extent in a valid comment about the open source nature of AI development in China. And that I think we need to give Chinese developers like DeepSeek, for instance, a lot of credit for. But at the same time, I don't think we should romanticize what the Chinese are thinking and just adopt this at face value claim that China is interested in floating up and lifting all boats at once when it comes to AI advancement and specifically AI safety and regulation and governance as well, which we'll get into shortly. So that's my answer to your second question. I do think geopolitics is relevant and amplifying and exacerbating and contributing towards these pre-existing issues pertaining to alignment in the status quo. But let's talk about the first question. Surely, right, the argument here surely is the individualization of AI model development surely offers a sort of pushback, a natural check against my worries, okay, or my thesis concerning divergences in AI behaviors. And here I would express two thoughts. And the first thought is, when it comes to AI models used in military and defense and also potentially what I call potentially antagonistic context, right? It is clear that there exists a diversity of models used. And of course, we're not just talking about generative AI or discriminative AI, but there's also a plentiful instances of use cases at large in these contexts. And yet, even whilst there exists diversity amongst the models developed by each of the countries and governments in these cases, such diversity does not thereby contribute towards the organic diversity of views at large that are required to check against what I call echo chamber impulses. And that's to say, if you have a defense department that has 10 to 15 different AI agents endowed with respectively broadly similar responsibilities they have to check and balance against one another, my worry isn't so much that they're all the same. They might be different. And yet on certain key issues, they are wholly aligned. For instance, American interests come first. Or for instance, we personally hold that individuals with this skin color are less likely to be quote unquote terrorists than individuals of another skin color. And that is a sort of skew, a bias that is not called out, that cannot be checked upon, because the diversity or the very limited diversity on this front amongst these 15 models would lead all of them to reinforce one another in generating the implication and a conclusion that it is okay to adopt racial profiling and screening. And unlike human beings saying it, when AI models yield these outputs, there's a veneer of uncritiquable legitimacy that we would think, okay, that seems pretty legit. Statistically, it is the case that individuals from a certain ethnic background are obviously more likely to commit X, Y, and Z, and therefore it is valid for us to adopt this immutable characteristic as a screening basis. That's my worry, right? It's not so much as no diversity full stop, but on issues where there should be heterogeneity and also checks and balances internally, we don't have that because of the means by which these models are developed. And then, of course, the second element of this question is about commercial, so consumer-facing AI models. And there, of course, there's the sycophancy, the tailoring, and AI models would adapt and learn reinforcement learning mechanisms. Sure, that's fair. But just because there's a diverse range of views and perspectives amongst consumers doesn't mean that this diverse range of viewpoints would capture or encapsulate or reflect what I've been trying to drive at here. And that is, if my inputs and if my views are not incorporated inputs in the development of this model point blank, whether it be because certain consumer technologies are not available where I am and only available in other jurisdictions and countries, or because of limits upon data flows, outflows, and inflows, then chances are, even if there's diversity and heterogeneity, that also fails to capture the more diverse range of cultural perspectives and beliefs and values that exists outside one's national or market borders, so to speak. So again, the thesis here is there's diversity, there's individualization, but there's adequate in resolving concerns to do with non-representativeness and non-reflectiveness of other countries and other jurisdictions' preferences. That I don't think is sufficient. And that's why I feel like your pushback is valid to some extent, but not adequate in overcoming my worry there.
So it sounds like your worry depends upon an empirical claim. And it's a reasonable empirical claim, but it's an empirical claim, I think. So it's something like, yeah, look, Reed, okay, fine. There's diversity among large language models or generative AI models more generally and other kinds of AI. I'll grant you that, but the truth is that they all bear a certain family resemblance to each other. Or more specifically, they're all, the diversity all exists along a foundation of
normative family
homogeneity.
resemblance or value-based.
Yeah. So there's similar normative or ethical assumptions that are built into the diverse array of technologies. Yeah, and then I guess I just don't know what to say to that. That sounds like a plausible empirical claim. I don't know how we would go about testing it or whether we even could, but that seems plausible. Let's move, though, instead of trying to figure out engaging in empirical speculation, although, again, I think your empirical claim is reasonable. Right. Let's move to the second part of your overall view, which is this claim that the responsibility for managing the litany of risks that you've run through falls on something like everyone or universally. And I take it that this is, at least in part, a pushback on a kind of view in the culture, which is that it's the responsibility of OpenAI. It's the responsibility of Microsoft, of Google. And it feels to me, or it seems to me that you're saying that's the wrong view. The responsibility is far more distributed. So, is that right? And if so, what does that distributed responsibility look like?
Of course, if I may, Reed, I just want to talk very briefly about another dimension here, because we've just focused on the first dimension of the intersection between geopolitical and AI risk. But I want to just bring in very quickly the second dimension before moving on to tackling your question there. And that is what I worry about here in SASCO is also accountability gulfs and accountability deficits, right? And that is, to paint it most bluntly, in the event that in a war you've got a government that opts to use an AI-based software to identify and target enemy combatants or prospective combatants, okay? And by and large, AI uses facial recognition paired with an algorithm-based model to identify individuals who look the most and resemble the most prospective belligerents, right? And execute, sometimes literally, or execute commands to restrain, if not decapitate, these individuals. Say that occurs, and it's found that this AI software, in the end, was not, in fact, adequately trained to be able to fine grain, and differentiate across different specimens, such that it is excessively coarse-grained, and it was revealed as the case. With whom would the liability fall in this particular case? Would it fall with the developer of the application or developer of the program? With the army's commanders? With the soldiers who deployed the program? With the government per se, or the politicians? These are questions that, of course, in the context of any AI usage at large, it's already germane, right? Self-driving cars, algorithmic injustices, prejudices that are reinforced by AI models in courts, okay. But in the context of wars and international conflicts and skirmishes, these questions become all the more salient because they cut across borders and boundaries, because they involve necessarily actors that are not easily appraisable and adjudicated, or at least judged within the same jurisdiction. So that is a concern I have. And again, I think geopolitics compounds. It doesn't create this sort of novel kind of sui generis risk, but it compounds pre-existing risks in very peculiar settings. And that's another prong of the investigation at hand. But let's move on to your questionnaire, unless you have any thoughts on this particular front, really.
So just to be clear, you mentioned two accountability things. One was a accountability gap. The other was a deficit. I take it the gap is that when systems are deployed and have negative impacts, and there's so many cooks in the kitchen, how do we figure out which cooks bear which level of responsibility? That's the gap part. What's the accountability deficit?
Let's call it slack, right? The failure on the part of actors to take up their end of the bargain. So suppose we argue, based on some methods of, say, moral liability or moral responsibility framework, that actors X, Y, and Z are responsible. They're causally, and beyond that, they're also morally responsible for certain harms inflicted upon actors Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. So we argue that, okay, from a point of view of what is morally just, you've got to compensate your victims. And indeed, you might throw in a further element of legal accountability and say, by international law standards, you also have to compensate your victims and make reparations. But then they say, I don't want to. I'm not interested. What mechanism do you have against me to enforce against me? In the failure to take up the burdens to repair, that's when accountability deficit emerges. because it's a failure on the
Mm-hmm.
part of
Mm-hmm.
the relevant actors to discharge the responsibilities. And maybe this failure, in fact, as I would argue shortly as a segue into my answer, it doesn't just reflect poorly upon those who are behaving with impunity here and who basically say, okay, I've committed harms, but there's nothing you can do to me over that, so I'm going to get away scot-free. It also reflects a systemic
Yeah.
failure on a part of whether it be international legal systems and norms, also institutions, alternatively, the citizens, and of course, representatives and authorized representatives acting on behalf of these citizens, like the governments, in a variety of jurisdictions we're speaking of here. And that also is precisely why I think responsibility vis-a-vis the risks and also the harms, to the extent that are actually actualized, right? The harms of geopolitical times AI interactions. That's exactly why I personally think that responsibility must be diffused as opposed to exclusively parceled out in accordance with moral responsibility or blameworthiness. And just to be clear here, to answer your question about the assignment of liabilities, this is what I personally believe. I think the two different methods and two different paradigms by which we approach liability assignment, right? And here I'm drawing upon the works of Avia Pasternak, of course, and talking about basically the idea of proportional distribution and non-proportional distribution. Proportional distribution basically posits that we can allocate liability to take up, of course, the cost of compensation and, more generally speaking, reparation in accordance with the relationships between the perpetrators of wrongdoings and the victims of wrongdoing. So if I kill someone, then obviously I am morally at fault here, right? If I stole from someone, again, I'm morally at fault, blameworthy for the theft, assuming that I'm fully conscious, voluntary, autonomous, or so on and so forth. And thus, I could be reasonably held accountable over what I've done to the victim of my theft, to the victim of my murder. And there's therefore
Sure.
proportional or proportionate allocation of responsibility to me, but not to the average Joe down the street or down the road from where the theft occurred. Now, that is essentially the standards, the moral liability-centered framework of responsibility assignment.
Sure.
I don't
Yeah.
think we should do away with this.
Yeah. You
I
did
think
the
this
bad thing, so
remains
you're
relevant
responsible.
still, even in the world of AI and geopolitical risks in abstract, right? So if someone comes up with a devastating virus, and this is not AI, but just a virus that destroys and sabotages digital infrastructure, I do think that that individual who's engaging in this act of sabotage, a saboteur, should be held, not just morally responsible, but ideally also within the context of domestic laws, right? Criminally responsible. So I'm not disputing the validity and relevance of this paradigm. What I am saying here, though, is this paradigm is hugely limited. It's hugely limited when it comes to all the risks that we've surveyed just then, but also in general, all the other risks that occur on an international scale arising from AI development. To say that, okay, I would hold someone criminally liable over the development of an AI program that allows for the targeting of dissidents as much as it makes life much easier for folks who are trying to basically hop on a tube without necessarily taking out the card. So using facial recognition as a method for payment, for instance, versus facial recognition for far more pernicious purposes, the dual use nature of these technologies means that it would be absurd for me to say, yeah, I'm going to criminally hold liable the engineers and developers of this particular software. That just doesn't seem particularly reasonable or indeed practicable. So in this instance, given the duality or in nature of both the benefits and also the downsides arising from certain technologies, but also how complex the very developmental process, right? You need basically a village literally to raise a model, right? Whether it be in terms of data labeling engineers, those who are leading the product development teams, the fundraisers, the investors, the LPs and VCs. It takes a village to raise a very good products like, say, Cloud or OpenAI or whatnot. Then the implication here is I don't think we should look at responsibility in these cases through the lenses of moral responsibility or blameworthiness, nor indeed should we use the proportional method of distribution. And instead, we should look towards non-proportional methods of distributing responsibility that go or that operates, broadly speaking, along the following lines. We are all actors that operate within, in a loosest defined manner, systems, structures, and also, by extension, the interactions between systems and structures of norms, of values and rituals that increasingly permeated by the force of AI-based automation and also, more generally speaking, AI development. And this structure, these structures that we inhabit, we cannot escape from. We cannot say, oh, I opt out of all of this. Of course, I can move to an island and live Robin Williams, of course, from Outcast. That's a possibility, right, in theory. But even then, I'd still be...
Tom Hanks.
Sorry?
Tom Hanks. Tom
yes,
Hanks,
you're right.
Robin
Tom
Williams.
Hanks.
Tom
Robin
Hanks.
Williams. My bad.
And Castaway.
Castaway. Castaway, yeah.
Don't let it happen.
Bad memory.
Yeah. It's, everything you said was
Castaway,
perfect, except for that.
I think the movie's Castaway. Anyway, long story, I choose to do that. That's fine. But that's very improbable and unlikely for 99.99% of people inhabiting our planet today. We are all, whether or not we like it or not, we're all involved and entangled in this complex web. Some of us are entangled as quasi-complicit actors in that, in a loosest possible, in a very diffuse manner, we are contributing towards the hegemony of powerful data empires, and AI empires. Some of us might actually be victims, right? So my data is taken without my consent, without my knowing, to feed into these models, all because I didn't read the AI. I consent to my data's being utilized in a way that allows me to be cognizant of the risks and the downstream implications of my signing away my data. And of course, some of us are both victims and complicit actors and also perpetrators of injustices in our own right. So it's a very complex bundle, right? It's very hard to say, you're a victim, you're a perpetrator, you're in a wrong here, you're not in a wrong, you're in a clear. We can't say that because the real world is very messy. And so what I propose here instead is that we all possess, as a default, unless we're totally cut off and totally isolated from the AI space and the AI world at large, unless we're totally disconnected, my proposal is we all have forward-looking responsibilities that are not blame attached. They're not attached to blame. They're not attached to moral responsibility. So they're separate, that nevertheless compel us to respond to the structural injustices that exist in the status quo. And this is where I can talk a bit more about the structurality of the injustice as opposed to the individuality of the injustices that we see occurring on a global level. I draw heavily upon Iris Marion Young's theory of the social connection model of justice and also the structural injustice in a paradigm by which she looks at processes like global sweatshop labor, forced labor and enslavement, and of course, the way women are treated in structurally misogynistic societies. Iris Marion Young basically points to cases where there's no overt individualized wrong, where there's no actor acting in a way that you can say this is morally wrong on their own, and yet collectively, we see processes where large groups, are dominated by other groups who stand to benefit from their domination and subjugation. And that's what IMY was talking about in her original thesis, right, on social connection and also the 5 different faces of oppression as well. And I try to apply her theory to specifically AI on a global level to make the argument that given all these plethora of issues and problems we've looked at, it's futile to try and just solve this through moral responsibility assignment and result in liability assignment on a proportional basis. It's high time that we thought about a non-proportional approach to the question at hand, and that's also what spurs my overarching methodology and preoccupation on this front.
So that was a lot.
Yeah, sorry, it was a stream of consciousness just running through all these ideas.
No worries. No, that's great. Let me zoom out for a second. Let's see if I can capture what's being said. I take it that we start off with these concepts of accountability gap and accountability deficit. The accountability gap occurs for the simple reason that it's just not clear who the hell owns this. Something bad happened. Who the hell's to blame? Who are we supposed to hold accountable? It's utterly unclear because there's so many cooks in the kitchen. That's the accountability gap. Deficit is bad shit happened. No one gave them any sort of reparations or compensation for the bad shit happening to them. And now we've got this gap between what people are owed and what they're actually paid, so to speak, what they're actually given. Okay, so we take that. Now we take those concepts, we take them to the realm of AI, and we say, look, in the context of AI, bad shit's going to happen. There's lots of cooks in the kitchen, and so we're going to get an accountability gap when it comes to AI. We're also going to get, in part because there's no legal system for all this, for assigning legal responsibility for AI, we're going to get the accountability deficit because those people harmed by AI won't have anyone around who's going to compensate them for the harms they suffered. And so you've got two moves to make. You could either say, here's a proposition. If you can't identify discrete individuals who are accountable and who owe, then no one is responsible. That's proposition one. Proposition two is, if you can't identify discrete individuals who are accountable for the gap and the deficit, then everyone is responsible. And the standard model for responsibility is, it's a discrete person who killed the guy, so that discrete person is responsible. You say, no, forget that. I reject proposition one. I accept proposition two. Everyone is responsible. So that means there's what's attributable to the we and what's attributable to each member of the we. So I'm going to play a little bit fast and loose with that for a second. But I take it that at the upshot of all this is that for any individual who is in some way or other causally connected to the AI ecosystem, user, creator of data, labeler, blah, 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 whatever. There's all sorts of ways of being causally connected to that AI ecosystem. Then when you write up your ledger of responsibilities I've got, everyone's got to write down in their notebook, I've got a responsibility to make reparations for the people who are harmed by AI.
Very good. Very good.
Is that
clarification there? I think the one way of conceptualizing this, by the way, readers, is to see it as a funnel. Right? What do I mean a funnel? Let's start with the broadest cross-section of the funnel, where I would say in the initial stages of liability assignment, we should, in fact, look towards a more standard proportional model of liability assignment. Still, I'm not saying we should repudiate or reject it altogether. I'm saying that's a starting point, right? So we try to do that. Okay, we go ahead with it. And let's just imagine that in an ideal world, we can legally enshrine moral liability assignment and have some sort of internationally applicable cross-jurisdictional laws that can actually be generated to reflect these responsibilities, right? So we can hold to account terrorists who come up with or utilize AI in an intentionally malicious manner. Fine. Good. And yet, because of accountability deficits and also accountability gaps, more specifically accountability gaps per se, right? Because even in the case of accountability deficits, maybe the solution is to improve enforcement, to give enforcement agencies more teeth, to have better and more refined international arbitration and also these adjudication processes to capture and also hold to account these actors who are behaving in an intentionally malicious way. But in instances where accountability gaps prevail, that is when we move into the second stage of the funnel. And there, of course, I think I should have been much clearer, and I apologize on that front, with regards to the conditions for the development of this forward-looking responsibility. Because intuitively, if I said to you, a one-day-old infant whose birth data was translated into this biostatistica data-based app that does diagnostics.
They're causally connected, but
this one-day-old baby is responsible. What are you talking about, Brian? So I want to be very clear here, drawing upon Maeve McCohen's work in looking at reproduction-centered or a reproduction-centric interpretation of this idea of a social connection. Because Maeve basically says Iris was not very clear as to what social connection means, and her suggestion is we should look at the concept of reproduction, not biological reproduction, so to speak, but if my actions, my intentional actions, are reproducing structures, okay, reproducing the background conditions giving rise to structural injustices, then that would qualify me as being on a hook, so to speak, even though it's not a blame-attached hook. And what is this sort of intentional activity contributing towards background conditions actually mean? It means if in my behaving in a certain fashion or ways, I'm causally making an impact, not necessarily a counterfactual difference, but I'm causally making an impact. I'm influencing, okay, in a sort of late Louisian sense of the word of causal influence. I'm influencing how certain background conditions that give rise to it, these injustices actually operate. Then I could be seen as someone who is indeed socially connected, right? So if I buy a shirt that's made using sweatshop labor, the shirt's already there whether or not I buy it or not. So I'm not making any counterfactual difference, but I'm causally influencing the nature of the product delivery, whether or not the product goes to me or to Bob or to David. I'm influencing that. And that is in turn a part of the background conditions that sustains a global sweatshop trade, right, of shirts, for instance, then that is a case where I'm socially connected to the injustice. Whereas an infant who is incapable of developing such intentionalities probably doesn't know that the milk it's consuming is made with baby formula that is in turn contaminated with, or perhaps a product of producers trying to cut corners with the production of the milk formula. I don't think we would say the baby there is socially connected to the injustice. So that is why the second stage of the funnel is not everyone comes in, everyone's embroiled, and you're all responsible. I don't want to give off that impression, because that, of course, leads to pretty bizarre and counterintuitive implications. Then finally,
So let's do this. We had talked that we probably need a part 2 where we spell this out. I get the sort of, you're worried about the counterexample of the baby, so we can, let's get clear about what the call. Let's put that to the side for a second, because I have one final question, I think, on this front. And then I think we can, for part 2, we can really dive into the sort of philosophical underpinnings that really informs this view about people's responsibility. So here's the last question. So suppose I grant you pretty much everything you've said so far. I don't get super worked up about counterexamples about babies and things like that. And I say, okay, for all the relevant people, whoever those turn out to be, all the relevant people in the we, they have to write down in their ledger and their book of obligations or book of responsibilities, I'm responsible for doing stuff to get this a bit like pragmatic, practical, in the weeds just a little bit. Okay, here I am, I'm Reed. There you are, you're Brian. We're surely in that list of the set of relevant people because we're sufficiently causally connected to that AI ecosystem, blah, blah. Literally, what am I supposed to do? What does my having that responsibility entail? I wake up tomorrow, it's my Tuesday, tomorrow's your Wednesday, whatever. I wake up, what am I supposed to do? What do I put on my to-do list as opposed to the abstract claim I've got responsibilities here?
I think in this case, I would suggest the following, okay? And there are broadly 3 action guiding parameters I see as relevant. The first is the push, to some extent, for a minimization of hostile or malicious multi-non-alignment. And that is to say, we should advocate and lobby, and in democracies, we should vote or make it a part of our electoral preference and a public publicized preference. They want our governments to come to some baselines and also alignment guardrails with other countries over the kinds of AI models that would be generated. That we don't have hostile, ethno-nationalistic, xenophobic preferences enshrined in the trading processes, especially when it comes to AI models that are used for publicly affecting and determinative decisions. We want to ensure that the problems I outlined in the first 25 minutes of this discussion with you are tackled somewhat through guidelines and protocols that shape how AI models are developed.
Okay.
Secondly,
so step 1 is get politically involved. And then we can sort of debate about what the policies ought to be, but whatever.
State, you can't really vote for your leaders. So what do? You've got to adopt institutionalized advocacy. You've got to work with players who are closer to the locus of power and pitch them and say, hey, guys, this is why it's really important. This is where your self-interest is aligned with these regulatory moves. Can we do it together? So it's not just about public sort of protests and contentious politics. It's also about working with the system and within the system.
Politics broadly construed.
The second element is accountability gaps. Tackling that is crucial. And of course, one way of going about it is to advocate the very model that we're talking about here. So public advocacy of the diffuse social connection model. But then if you're not a philosophically trained individual, you might say, that's not my cup of tea. What do I do? In those instances, I reckon we should turn our attention to accountability deficits. And that is where they're clearly actors that are morally liable. Okay? No doubt about it. And yet, at present, they're not being held to account because they've got coverage. They've got some backing by institutions in position or actors in positions of power. That means that they can get away scot-free. And in fact, they can fund all these PR campaigns that position themselves as virtuous, sort of groundbreaking innovators delivering for humanity. In those instances, I think what we need to do here is to basically take big corporations, take these big actors to town, as Shoshana Zuboff called for in Surveillance Capitalism, right? To say, these are the instances where these actors are acting with impunity. Can we have some reckoning and grappling with that fact at present? If not, we'll make noise. If not, we'll use the courts. If not, we'll go through class actions, right? Formalizing basically the sort of pressure points and also punitive costs for actors that are behaving intentionally or otherwise in a way that endangers, right, the sort of safety and interests of humanity in a geopolitically intricate environment. That is another angle of praxis that we can contemplate. And finally, advocating and championing global governance frameworks, institutions, think tanks, research initiatives that say, look, there isn't much talking right now between countries. There isn't much conversation between governments and activists and practitioners from the EU, UK, China, ASEAN, and the US. Why don't we get together and start trying to set up some benchmarks and standards that our counterparts could follow, and also really use as a guiding almanac in supporting and enabling their responsible development and also usage of AI. So global governance, in my view, is not just a top-down product. It is not something that we say, governments can work on it, we just comply. If anything, it needs to be born. It must be birthed out of, right, this sort of this polis, that we construct amongst ourselves as members, as self-anointed, but also rightly digital citizens. Digital global citizens must reclaim agency by creating frameworks that cut across national and political boundaries and borders as well. And if you're sitting there at home thinking this sounds really idealistic, it sounds Pollyannish and kumbaya, of course, all of these aspirational goals and visions are kumbaya in some sense. They're not going to be panacea. They're not going to solve all the problems that exist. But if we refuse to even aspire towards these goals, then where does that leave us beyond or besides just sitting here and sulking in our pool of resignation? So I would suggest that, yes, it sounds lofty, but we can start with baby steps. And maybe one day we can actually arrive at something that's comparable to, if not better than, the sort of NPT that we have with nuclear weapons in the status quo. Now, of course, don't get me started on disanalogizability between nuclear weapons and AI. I can go on and about that for another 2 hours. But I will just say, of course, that we need a... Yes.
No doubt. Yeah.
We should always aim for the stars whilst also setting concretely realizable goals to guide us along the way. And on that note, I just want to say thank you, Reed. That was a really fun chat and conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. I take it just so I can see. I think the claim that they're at the end is what it is there to do is something like, I'm not going to tell you the specific thing to do. What I'm going to tell you is that a lot of the AI harms, the accountability gaps and deficits, result from features of the, broadly speaking, socioeconomic system or something along those lines. Social political systems writ large. And we're not concerned about the one person who was hurt by the AI who wasn't compensated. Go out and find that person and give him $20. And that's obviously not the model. Understand that these gaps and deficits occur as a result of a certain set of systems operating in the ways that they do. And there's various ways of influencing that system, both small and large. Whatever your resources happen to be, whatever time you've got, whatever your understanding is, whatever levers you've got to pull, do some of that. It shouldn't be a burden that weighs on you every single second of the day. But if you've got some time to spare, write to your Congress, in America anyway, write to your congressperson. If you're in a place that's a more authoritarian, start building a willing coalition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a perfect
Exactly. That's exactly where I stand in this matter. So thank you very much for you're just so precise. What I find amazing about you is you have this ability to translate and clarify and also offer very thoughtful pushbacks and commentaries. And that's really awesome when it comes to podcast hosting. So thank you for that.
It's my pleasure. And we're aligned. We're finally aligned. We're definitely aligned on that point. All right. Thanks so much, Brian. I'm looking forward to part 2 where we really dig into some abstract philosophical stuff. All right. Talk to you later. Bye. Bye. Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wassilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.